The late October wind whispered through the centuries-old live oaks lining St. Michael's Cemetery, their Spanish moss swaying like spectral fingers. Margaret Sullivan, Maggie to those who truly knew her, stood motionless before her husband's mahogany casket, her black silk dress rippling in the breeze. At 52, she carried herself with a grace that turned heads, even in grief. The scent of rain-dampened earth mingled with the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers, creating an oppressive atmosphere that matched Maggie's inner turmoil. Behind her, the whispers began, cutting through the somber silence like knives. "Did you see who she brought?" Martha Henderson's voice carried just far enough. Eric Ramirez. Barely waited for Thomas to get cold. Maggie's fingers tightened around her leather purse, her knuckles whitening. She could feel Eric's presence 3 steps behind her, a comfort and a source of guilt intertwined. At 48, he cut a striking figure in his charcoal suit. Thomas's former business partner, and now, something more. Reverend Phillips's words drifted over the gathering of Charleston's finest, his practiced tone carrying across the cemetery. Thomas Sullivan was a pillar of our community, a man whose vision shaped our skyline and whose generosity touched countless lives. The eulogy continued, but Maggie's mind wandered to last Tuesday, when she'd found Thomas in his study. The memory was crisp, etched into her mind with painful clarity. The half-empty whiskey glass on his desk, the way his reading glasses sat askew on his nose, how peaceful he looked, as if he'd simply fallen asleep reviewing contracts. The coroner called it a heart attack. Quick, painless. A blessing, they said. But as Maggie stood there, the weight of unspoken words and unrealized plans pressing down on her, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Thomas's sudden departure than met the eye. And now, his beloved wife would like to say a few words. Maggie approached the podium, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. 200 pairs of eyes followed her movement, a sea of black-clad figures blending with the somber landscape. She could feel Eric's gaze most keenly of all, a mixture of concern and something else, something that made her skin prickle with unease. "Thomas believed in building things," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Buildings, yes. Sullivan Construction wasn't just a company to him. But more than that, he believed in building relationships, trust, community." She paused, scanning the faces before her, noting the genuine sorrow in some and the calculated mask of grief in others. "For 30 years, he was my partner in all things. We weathered storms together, celebrated victories, and learned that love isn't just about the grand gestures. It's about showing up, day after day." In the front row, Thomas's sister Catherine dabbed at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. Next to her, their nephew William looked on with an unreadable expression, his sharp features a reflection of Thomas's in younger days. The Sullivan family had always been complicated, a tapestry of loyalties and rivalries woven over generations. As Maggie continued her eulogy, her gaze drifted to the Charleston skyline visible beyond the cemetery walls. The gleaming towers of the financial district stood as a testament to Thomas's vision, and to the ruthless world of high-stakes business that had consumed so much of their lives. After the service, mourners filed past, offering condolences with varying degrees of sincerity. Eric maintained a respectful distance, but his presence drew sideways glances and poorly concealed whispers. Maggie found herself torn between the desire for his comfort and the growing seed of doubt planted by Martha Henderson's cutting remark. "Maggie." Catherine's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "The reading is tomorrow at 10. Don't be late." Her eyes flicked to Eric, then back. "And please, show some discretion." Before Maggie could respond, Catherine turned sharply and walked away, her gray hair catching the afternoon light. The cemetery was emptying now, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the weight of unspoken words. Eric approached finally, his footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. "Ready to go?" Maggie nodded, but her eyes remained on Thomas's casket. The polished wood reflected the cloudy sky above, and for a moment, she saw herself. Not as she was now, but as she had been 30 years ago, young and full of certainty about the future she and Thomas would build. "He would have understood," Eric said softly, misreading her silence. Would he? Maggie wondered. Thomas, who had built an empire from nothing, who had given her everything she thought she wanted, who had grown distant in those final years. Would he have understood finding comfort in the arms of his closest friend and business partner? As they walked toward Eric's Tesla, Maggie felt the weight of stares following them. Charleston was a small city with a long memory. People would talk, they already were, but she had made her choice. Tomorrow, at the reading of the will, she would face the consequences of that choice. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind St. Michael's and its judgments. Through the rearview mirror, Maggie watched Thomas's final resting place recede into the distance. The live oaks swayed in the wind, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, as if trying to hold onto secrets best left buried. The Sullivan estate loomed against the darkening sky, its antebellum architecture a testament to old money and older secrets. Maggie's heels clicked against the marble foyer as she entered, Eric close behind. The wake would begin soon, though she wished she could skip it entirely. The house seemed to breathe with memories. Every corner held echoes of Thomas. His laughter during holiday parties, his frustrated sighs during late-night work sessions, the soft padding of his feet as he paced the hallways, wrestling with some business dilemma. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Maria, their housekeeper of 20 years, appeared from the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and the lines around her mouth seemed deeper than usual. "The caterers have everything set up in the dining room. And Mr. William called. He's bringing Ms. Catherine from the hotel." "Thank you, Maria." Maggie paused, feeling a sudden wave of affection for this woman who had been a constant presence in their lives. "And please, after all these years, you'll always be Mrs. Sullivan to me, Senora." Maria's gentle rebuke carried decades of loyalty. Her gaze slid to Eric before she disappeared back into the kitchen, a flicker of something, disapproval, concern, in her eyes. Eric loosened his tie, looking uncomfortable in the house for the first time Maggie could remember. "I can leave if you'd prefer to handle this alone." "No." Maggie's response came too quickly, betraying her own unease. "Stay, please." They moved through the house together, past photographs chronicling a life now ended. Thomas and Maggie at their wedding, her white dress a stark contrast to the vibrant azaleas in the background. Breaking ground on their first major project, both of them laughing as they struggled with an oversized golden shovel. Charity galas and Christmas parties, their smiles growing more practiced with each passing year. Happy moments frozen in time, betraying nothing of the silences that had grown between them like frost on windows. The first guests arrived at 6, bearing casseroles and condolences. Maggie played her part perfectly, the grieving widow, gracious in her sorrow. She accepted hugs from Thomas's golf partners, endured pitying looks from the country club wives, and pretended not to notice how conversations stopped when she entered rooms. "He was such a good man," Eleanor Matthews said, clutching Maggie's hands. Her diamonds caught the light, winking like stars. "The way he helped John and me secure that loan for our restaurant." Her voice trailed off meaningfully. Yes, Thomas had been generous. Sometimes too generous, especially with friends in need. The thought triggered a memory from 3 months ago. Thomas in his study, agitated, shuffling through papers. "It doesn't add up, Maggie," he'd said, his voice tight with frustration. "The numbers don't make sense." She dismissed his concerns, attributed them to stress and too much scotch. Now, watching Eric chat with the bank president across the room, something nagged at the edges of her consciousness. Had she missed something important in her husband's final months? "Quite a turnout," William observed, materializing beside her. At 35, he had Thomas's height, but none of his warmth. His eyes, a shade darker than his uncle's, scanned the room with cool detachment. Uncle Thomas would have appreciated the spectacle. "This isn't a spectacle, William. It's a wake." Maggie felt a flare of irritation at her nephew's callousness. "Is it?" His eyes drifted to Eric, who was now deep in conversation with one of the Sullivan Construction Board members. Interesting choice of companion. Before Maggie could respond, Catherine's sharp voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "William, help me with something in the kitchen." Left alone, Maggie found herself drawn to Thomas's study. The room still smelled of leather and his preferred cologne, notes of sandalwood and cedar that had always reminded her of their early years together. She ran her fingers along his desk, remembering how she'd found him there just days ago. The medical examiner had been clear, natural causes. Yet something felt unfinished, like a conversation interrupted mid-sentence. "I thought I'd find you here." Eric stood in the doorway, his silhouette familiar yet suddenly strange. How many times had he been in this room, working late with Thomas on project proposals? When had comfort turned to attraction, and attraction to something more? "Everyone's asking about tomorrow," he said, stepping inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, an oddly homely sound in the midst of their shared guilt. The reading, "Let them ask." Maggie opened Thomas's desk drawer, finding his reading glasses folded neatly inside. She held them gently, as if they might crumble to dust in her hands. Thomas was nothing if not methodical. "Everything will be in order." "Maggie." Eric's voice softened, and he moved closer. She could smell his aftershave, so different from Thomas's. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." She looked up at him, this man who had been Thomas's friend long before he was her comfort. In the dim light, shadows played across his face, making him almost unrecognizable. A chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. "Will we?" she asked, more to herself than to him. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maria stood there, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Catherine is asking for you. Something about the arrangements for tomorrow." Maggie nodded, replacing the glasses in the drawer. As she left the study, she caught a glimpse of Eric running his hand along Thomas's desk, his fingers lingering on the locked bottom drawer. The gesture seemed innocent enough, but something about it settled in her stomach like a stone. In the living room, Catherine held court among the remaining guests, her grief worn like armor. Their eyes met across the room, and Maggie saw something there. Not just sorrow or anger, but knowledge. Catherine had always been too observant for comfort. Tomorrow, Maggie thought, everything would change. The will would be read, and with it, whatever secrets Thomas had chosen to take to his grave, or leave behind. As she rejoined the wake, plastering on a smile for yet another sympathetic guest, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to plunge into depths she couldn't begin to fathom. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, its deep tones a reminder that time marched on, indifferent to their loss. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Charleston wept for Thomas Sullivan, or perhaps for the secrets that died with him. The law offices of Reynolds and Associates occupied the entire 10th floor of Charleston's oldest commercial building, a towering Victorian structure that had weathered hurricanes and history alike. At precisely 10 o'clock, Harrison Reynolds, who had handled the Sullivan family's legal affairs for 3 decades, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The leather chair creaked beneath him, a sound that seemed to echo the tension in the room. "Before we begin," he said, surveying the room's occupants with eyes that had seen countless family dramas unfold. Mr. Sullivan was very specific about who should be present for this reading. Maggie sat straight-backed in her chair, conscious of Eric's presence beside her. His knee bounced slightly, a rare display of nerves from a man usually so composed. Across the mahogany conference table, its surface reflecting the Charleston skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Catherine and William maintained their vigil of disapproval. The morning light cast long shadows across the polished table, like bars of a cage closing in around them. "Proceed, Harrison," Catherine said, her voice clipped. She sat ramrod straight, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to tighten the skin around her eyes. Reynolds nodded, breaking the seal on a thick envelope. The sound of tearing paper was unnaturally loud in the hushed room. "This last will and testament was updated 3 months ago, on August 15th. Maggie's breath caught. 3 months ago, around the time Thomas had started acting strangely, obsessing over company records. She glanced at Eric, but his expression remained carefully neutral, his eyes fixed on the envelope in Reynolds' hands. "I, Thomas James Sullivan, being of sound mind and body." Reynolds began the formal reading, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. The initial provisions were standard: charitable donations, provisions for Maria and other long-term employees, specific bequests of personal items. Maggie found her mind wandering, remembering the day Thomas had first brought her to this office, young and in love, to sign their prenuptial agreement. "To my sister Catherine," Reynolds continued, "I leave my mother's jewelry collection and my shares in the Sullivan Family Trust." Catherine's face remained impassive, though her fingers tightened around her purse. The emerald ring on her right hand, a family heirloom, caught the light, sending small rainbows dancing across the table. "To my nephew William," I leave my collection of rare books and my membership at Charleston Country Club. William's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. He'd clearly expected more, and Maggie felt a flicker of satisfaction at his disappointment. Now, regarding Sullivan Construction, Reynolds paused, adjusting his glasses again. The room seemed to hold its breath. The company's ownership structure will be... He frowned, flipping through the pages. I apologize. There seems to be an addendum. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Maggie felt Eric shift beside her, his calm facade cracking slightly. Dated September 30th, Reynolds continued, his brow furrowed. In light of recent discoveries regarding certain financial discrepancies, I hereby modify the succession plan for Sullivan Construction. An independent audit will be conducted before any transfer of ownership can occur. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie's mind raced back to Thomas's agitation that night in his study. Financial discrepancies? She looked at Eric, searching his face for any sign of recognition or guilt, but found only confusion that mirrored her own. Furthermore, Reynolds read, his voice taking on a grave tone, I appoint my nephew, William Sullivan, as interim CEO during the audit period. What? Eric's composure cracked entirely. He half rose from his chair, color rising in his face. That's impossible. I was next in line. Thomas and I discussed it countless times. Mr. Ramirez, Reynolds said firmly, please allow me to finish. But Eric was already on his feet, his hands splayed on the table. This is ridiculous. Thomas would never... Sit down, Eric. Maggie's voice cut through his protest like a whip. She could feel Catherine watching them, satisfaction playing at the corners of her mouth. Reynolds cleared his throat again, the sound like gravel. Regarding the personal estate, he paused, looking directly at Maggie. Mrs. Sullivan, your husband left specific instructions about the family home and his personal assets. Maggie's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. This was it, the moment that would either secure her future or destroy it. The Sullivan estate is to be held in trust, Reynolds read, managed by a board of trustees including Catherine Sullivan and Harrison Reynolds, until such time as the aforementioned audit is complete and any criminal investigations are concluded. Criminal investigations? Maggie's voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if coming from the bottom of a well. What criminal investigations? Reynolds removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The gesture made him look older, more vulnerable. Mrs. Sullivan, there's a sealed envelope here that I'm required to deliver to the Charleston Police Department immediately following this reading. The room spun slightly. Maggie felt Eric's hand on her arm, but she pulled away. Through the window, she could see the spire of St. Michael's Church where they'd buried Thomas 2 days ago. Had he known something? Had those late nights in his study, those agitated conversations about numbers not adding up, been more than just stress and paranoia? This is outrageous, Eric started again, but William cut him off. Is it, Mr. Ramirez? William's voice was cold, calculating. Perhaps Uncle Thomas finally figured out what you... That's enough. Reynolds' voice cracked like a gavel. There's more to be read, and I suggest we continue without interruption. Maggie stared at her hands, at the wedding ring she still wore. Thomas had always been methodical, calculating. If he'd changed his will, if he'd prepared documents for the police, he must have had reasons. She looked at Eric, really looked at him, and for the first time saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not grief or anger, but fear. As Reynolds continued reading, outlining the complex web of trusts and conditions Thomas had put in place, Maggie felt as though she were standing on shifting sand. Everything she thought she knew, about her husband, about Eric, about her own place in this world they'd built together, was crumbling beneath her feet. The tension in Reynolds' office shattered with the sound of the door swinging open. A tall man in his mid-30s stood in the doorway, his dark suit slightly rumpled, as if he'd just stepped off a plane. His eyes, a startling shade of green that Maggie had only ever seen on one other person, scanned the room quickly before settling on her. Sorry I'm late. Traffic from Montreal was brutal. His accent carried traces of Quebec, softened by years abroad. I'm Liam O'Connor, Thomas's nephew. Catherine rose halfway from her chair, her composure slipping for the first time. Liam? What are you doing here? Uncle Thomas sent me a letter 3 weeks ago. He moved into the room with casual confidence, nodding to Reynolds. Asked me to be here today. Said it was important. Maggie studied him, Her husband's nephew from his first wife's side, the one who'd disappeared into international finance years ago. Thomas had mentioned him occasionally, always with a mix of pride and regret. The prodigal nephew who'd chosen his own path instead of joining the family business. Reynolds shuffled through his papers, frowning. Yes, Mr. O'Connor is indeed listed as a required attendee. I apologize for the oversight. How convenient, Eric muttered. But Liam either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. He took the empty seat beside William, directly across from Maggie. His eyes, sharp and observant, just like Thomas's, moved between her and Eric before settling on Reynolds. Please continue. I didn't mean to interrupt. As I was saying, Reynolds resumed, regarding the sealed envelope for the police. Actually, Liam interrupted, reaching into his briefcase. I have something that might be relevant. He produced a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and creased with use. Uncle Thomas sent this with his letter. Said if anything happened to him, I should bring it today. The room went still. Maggie recognized the journal. She'd seen Thomas writing in it countless evenings, especially in those final months. He'd always kept it locked in his desk drawer, away from prying eyes. That's private property, Eric said sharply, leaning forward. It belongs to the estate. Actually, Reynolds interjected, consulting his papers once more. The journal is specifically mentioned here. My personal journal, currently in the possession of Liam O'Connor, is to be reviewed by Mr. Reynolds before proceeding with any transfer of assets. Catherine's eyes narrowed, her gaze fixed on Liam. You've been in contact with Thomas all this time. We never lost touch, Liam replied simply, his tone betraying nothing. He needed someone outside the immediate circle, someone who could see things clearly. His gaze flickered to Eric. Someone who understood international banking. Eric's face flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything. Liam's tone remained neutral, but there was a hardness in his eyes that reminded Maggie forcefully of Thomas. I'm just here to fulfill my uncle's last request. Maggie watched the exchange, her mind racing. Thomas had always been 3 steps ahead in business. Had he been preparing for something? Is that why he'd reached out to Liam? Mr. Reynolds, she said, finding her voice at last. Perhaps we should take a brief recess while you review the journal. Reynolds nodded, looking relieved. Yes, I think that would be wise. Shall we reconvene in an hour? As chairs scraped back and tension simmered, Liam caught Maggie's eye. Mrs. Sullivan, could I have a word? Privately? Before Eric could object, Maggie nodded. We can use Reynolds' private office. The smaller office overlooked the harbor. Charleston's historic waterfront spread out below like a painting. Liam closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression softening. He was trying to protect you, he said without preamble. Protect me from what? Uncle Thomas discovered something about 3 months ago. That's why he contacted me. He needed someone with experience in forensic accounting. Maggie's heart pounded. The financial discrepancies he mentioned were just the beginning. Liam moved to the window, his reflection overlaying the city skyline. He was gathering evidence, building a case. The journal contains names, dates, transaction records. He knew someone might try to stop him, so he sent me copies of everything. Someone like who? But even as she asked, Maggie felt the pieces starting to fall into place. The late-night meetings, Eric's increasing presence at the house, Thomas's sudden interest in the company's international accounts. I think you already know, Liam said quietly, turning back to face her. His eyes, so like Thomas's, held a mixture of sympathy and determination. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Outside, seagulls wheeled above the harbor, their cries muffled by the thick glass. Maggie thought of Thomas in his study that last night. The whiskey glass, the paper spread across his desk. Had it really been a heart attack? Tell me everything, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Everything Thomas told you. Liam nodded, pulling a chair out for her. As Maggie sat down, she felt as though she were stepping onto a path from which there was no return. Whatever Liam was about to reveal, she knew it would change everything. Her understanding of her husband, her marriage, and the empire they had built together. It started, Liam began, his voice low and intense, with a series of transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Reynolds' office windows as Maggie absorbed Liam's revelations. Each detail hit like a physical blow. Offshore accounts, falsified contracts, millions siphoned through shell companies. The Charleston skyline, once a testament to Thomas's vision, now seemed to mock her with its gleaming facades. "This transfer," Liam said, pointing to a page in Thomas's journal, his finger tracing a line of meticulous handwriting. "It happened the day before he contacted me. $5 million to a company called Meridian Global Holdings." Maggie frowned, the name unfamiliar. "I've never heard of it." "You wouldn't have. It was incorporated 3 years ago in Cyprus." Liam's finger traced down the page. "But look who signed as the beneficial owner." Maggie's breath caught. There, in Thomas's precise handwriting, was Eric's signature. Not just a description, but a photocopy carefully pasted into the journal. The implications hit her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. "It gets worse," Liam continued, his voice gentle but relentless. "Uncle Thomas found a pattern going back 5 years. Small amounts at first, then larger. Always just below the threshold that would trigger automatic audits. A memory surfaced. Eric and Thomas arguing in the study last summer. She'd thought it was about a construction bid. But now... "The night Thomas died," she said slowly, piecing together fragments of memory. "Eric insisted on coming over. Said they had urgent business to discuss." Liam's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Did you hear their conversation?" "No, I was upstairs. When I came down later." Her voice trailed off as another memory clicked into place. Eric was already gone, but Thomas was agitated. He kept saying he needed to make things right. A knock at the door interrupted them. Reynolds stood in the doorway, his face grave, years of maintaining a professional demeanor cracking under the weight of what he'd read. "I've reviewed the journal and made some calls. The police are on their way." "Does Eric know?" Maggie asked, her heart racing. "He left about 20 minutes ago. Said he had an urgent meeting." Liam was already reaching for his phone. "I'll alert the airport. If he tries to leave the country..." "He won't," Maggie interrupted, a sudden clarity cutting through her shock. "Not yet. There's something he needs first." Both men turned to her, questioning. Thomas kept a safe in his study, behind the Hopper print. She twisted her wedding ring nervously, a habit she thought she'd broken years ago. "I saw Eric looking at it during the wake. Whatever evidence Thomas had, the originals, they must be there." "We need to get to your house," Liam said, already moving, now. The drive to the Sullivan estate took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Every second ticked by with excruciating slowness, each familiar Charleston street blurring past the window. Maggie sat in the passenger seat of Liam's rental car, her mind a whirlwind of memories and questions. How had she been so blind? "It wasn't your fault," Liam said, as if reading her thoughts. His eyes remained fixed on the road, but his voice was gentle. "Eric fooled everyone. Even Thomas trusted him for years." "I did more than trust him," she whispered, shame coloring her words. "After Thomas became distant, after the silences grew too long," she couldn't finish. "Uncle Thomas knew." Liam's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "It's in the journal. He blamed himself for neglecting you, for becoming obsessed with uncovering the fraud. He understood why you turned to Eric." They pulled into the estate's circular driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Eric's Tesla was parked haphazardly near the front steps, as if he'd been in a hurry. "He's here." Maggie's heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. "We're too late." "No," Liam said, pulling out his phone. His voice was steady, calming. "We're right on time. The police are 3 minutes out. We just need to keep him here." Inside, they heard movement from the study. Maggie led the way, her heels silent on the thick carpet. The study door was open, and there was Eric, the Hopper print askew on the wall, working frantically at the safe with what looked like an electronic decoder. "It won't work," Maggie said clearly, her voice steadier than she felt. Eric spun around, his usual composure shattered. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes were wild. "Maggie, I was just looking for these..." She reached into her purse and withdrew a USB drive. It was a bluff. She had no such thing. But Eric's face went pale. "You don't understand," he started, taking a step forward. His voice took on a pleading tone she'd never heard before. "Thomas was going to ruin everything. The company, our future. By exposing your theft..." Liam stepped into the room, his presence solid and reassuring at Maggie's side. Eric's expression hardened, a mask of charm slipping into place. You have no idea what it took to build this company. The corners we had to cut, the deals we had to make. Thomas was becoming a liability with his sudden attack of conscience. The implication hung in the air like poison. Maggie felt sick. What did you do to him? Her voice shook, betraying her fear. That night, what really happened? Eric's laugh was hollow, devoid of warmth. Does it matter now? In an hour, I'll be gone. The evidence will be destroyed. It's your word against mine. And who's going to believe the grieving widow who was sleeping with her husband's killer? They'll believe this. Thomas's voice recorder app played clearly from Liam's phone, having captured every word of Eric's confession. Eric lunged for the phone, desperation etched on his face. But the sound of sirens filled the air, growing closer with each passing second. Red and blue lights flashed through the study windows. In the distance, car doors slammed. It's over, Liam said quietly. Maggie watched as the man she thought she knew, the man she had betrayed her husband for, crumpled into a chair, his face in his hands. Outside, footsteps approached on the gravel drive. The truth, like the evening shadows, was finally closing in. The police took Eric away in handcuffs as the sun set over Charleston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful given the circumstances. Detective Sarah Chen remained behind, her notebook open on Thomas's desk, asking questions Maggie never thought she'd have to answer. So you had no knowledge of the embezzlement? Chen's dark eyes were sympathetic but probing. She was young for a detective, but her gaze held a sharpness that spoke of a keen mind. No. Maggie sat in Thomas's leather chair, feeling both out of place and exactly where she needed to be. The familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar enveloped her, a bittersweet reminder of what she'd lost. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined. And your relationship with Mr. Ramirez? The question stung, but Maggie forced herself to answer. Honesty was all she had left. It started 6 months ago. Thomas and I had grown apart. Eric was attentive. The words tasted bitter now. I thought he cared. He cared about access, Liam interjected from his position by the window. The fading light cast his face in shadow, reminding Maggie of Thomas's pensive moments. The affair gave him an excuse to be here, to watch Uncle Thomas more closely. Detective Chen nodded, making another note. Her pen scratched across the paper, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Mr. O'Connor, your uncle's journal suggests he suspected Mr. Ramirez was working with others. Any thoughts on that? Before Liam could answer, Maria appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Mrs. Sullivan? This was just delivered. She held out a cream-colored envelope, her hand trembling slightly. Maggie took it, noting there was no return address. The paper was expensive, the kind Thomas used for important correspondence. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. As she read, her hands began to shake. What is it? Liam moved closer, concern etched on his face. A threat. Maggie handed him the letter, her voice barely above a whisper. They say they have evidence of my relationship with Eric. If I don't convince the police to drop the investigation, they'll release it to the media. Make it look like we planned Thomas's death together. Chen was already pulling on latex gloves, her expression grim. May I? The letter was placed in an evidence bag, but Maggie barely noticed. Her mind was racing, piecing together fragments of conversations, odd glances, moments that had seemed innocuous, but now took on sinister meaning. There's more, isn't there? She looked at Liam, searching his face for confirmation of her growing suspicion. More people involved. Has to be, Liam confirmed, his jaw set. The amount of money involved? Eric couldn't have managed this alone. Mrs. Sullivan, Chen said carefully, her tone measured. Would you be willing to help us smoke them out? How? By letting them think their threat worked. We'll release a statement saying you're withdrawing your cooperation with the investigation. See who gets nervous or careless. Maggie thought of Thomas, of his final months spent gathering evidence, fighting alone against something bigger than she'd imagined. She wouldn't let his death be for nothing. I'll do it. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. The press release went out, carefully worded to suggest Maggie's withdrawal from the investigation without explicitly stating it. Her phone exploded with calls from reporters, most of which she ignored on Chen's advice. But one call, just after midnight, made her blood freeze. "You made the right choice," the digitally altered voice said, sending chills down her spine. "Now, about those documents Thomas left." Maggie followed her script, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games, Margaret. The evidence Eric couldn't find. We know Thomas gave it to someone he trusted, someone close." In the background, she heard Chen's team tracing the call. "Just keep them talking." "Even if I had something," Maggie said carefully, walking a tightrope between compliance and suspicion, "how would this work?" "Tomorrow, noon. The bench near the fountain at White Point Gardens. Come alone." The line went dead. "Got it," one of Chen's technicians announced, triumph in his voice. Call originated from the Marina District. "The Harbor Club," Liam said suddenly, his eyes widening with realization. It's the only place in that area with a secure enough line to hide behind that kind of voice alteration. Chen was already mobilizing her team, her movements precise and efficient. "Mrs. Sullivan, we'll need you to make that meeting tomorrow, but you'll be protected. Mr. O'Connor, we could use your help identifying potential suspects among the club members." Maggie stared out at the night, at the city she'd called home for 3 decades. Somewhere out there, behind one of those twinkling lights, were the people who had helped destroy her husband, who had used her relationship with Eric to further their schemes. "They'll be expecting me to be desperate," she said quietly, a new resolve hardening in her chest. "Afraid." Liam touched her shoulder gently, a gesture of support. "Are you?" "No." Maggie straightened in her chair, feeling more like herself than she had in months. "I'm angry, and they're about to learn what that means." As the investigation team worked through the night, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own dangers, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, fighting back, seeking justice, and finally, truly understanding the man she had married. And somewhere, she hoped, Thomas was watching, and proud. White Point Gardens shimmered in the midday sun, the old oak trees casting dappled shadows across the historic park. Maggie sat on the designated bench, a manila envelope in her lap, every nerve on high alert. Detective Chen's team was scattered throughout the park. A jogger here, a tourist with a camera there, a mother pushing a stroller. To the untrained eye, it was just another beautiful day in Charleston. Liam's voice came through her nearly invisible earpiece. "Movement at your 2 o'clock. Black suit, red tie." Maggie's heart stopped. Walking purposefully toward her was William Sullivan, Thomas's nephew, his face set in its usual mask of cold efficiency. She had suspected deep down, but seeing him approach still felt like a blow. "Hello, Aunt Maggie." He settled beside her without invitation, his cologne, expensive and familiar, wafting between them. "Lovely day for a meeting." "William." Despite her training for this moment, genuine shock colored her voice. "You're part of this." His laugh was soft and cruel, a sound she'd heard at countless family gatherings but never truly understood until now. "Part of it? I orchestrated it. Eric was just a puppet, useful for keeping Uncle Thomas distracted while we restructured the company's international holdings. The board members who were tired of Thomas's old-fashioned integrity." William's lip curled in disdain. "Do you know how much money we were leaving on the table with his ethical business practices?" He spat the words like they were poison. "Eric's little infatuation with you was an unexpected bonus. Made everything so much easier." Maggie clutched the envelope tighter, her knuckles whitening. "And Thomas's death? Was that part of your plan too?" "Let's call it an accelerated retirement." William held out his hand, his nails perfectly manicured. "The documents, please." "Why did you come yourself? Why not send another messenger?" "Because, dear aunt, family should handle family matters." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And after this, you're going to quietly disappear. Perhaps a long vacation to recover from your grief, somewhere without an extradition treaty." "That's not going to happen." Maggie's voice was steel, all pretense of fear gone. "No." William leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Think about the scandal. Thomas Sullivan's widow, involved in an affair with his murderer. Your reputation, Your place in Charleston society. Gone. Unless I give you these and run. Maggie stood slowly, her legs steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. You know what, William? Thomas was right about you. He blinked, confusion momentarily replacing his smug expression. What? He always said you were smart but sloppy, too arrogant to cover your tracks properly. William's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. He reached for the envelope, but Maggie stepped back. For instance, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Did you really think Thomas wouldn't install cameras in his study after the first break-in attempt? Or that Liam wouldn't recognize your signature on those Cayman transfers? Liam? William's composure cracked entirely. What does that failure know? Enough to unravel your entire operation. Liam's voice came from behind them. He emerged from behind an oak tree, phone in hand. Including your meeting last week with the board members at the Harbor Club. Excellent wine choice, by the way. The 2015 Bordeaux pairs perfectly with conspiracy. William lunged for the envelope, desperation etched on his face. But Chen's team converged from all directions, their casual disguises falling away. In seconds, he was surrounded. William Sullivan, Chen announced, producing handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and suspicion of involvement in the death of Thomas Sullivan. As they led him away, William called back over his shoulder, his voice a mixture of rage and fear. You have no idea what you've done, Maggie. No idea who you're dealing with. Actually, Maggie opened the envelope, revealing blank papers. I think I do. She watched as William was placed in an unmarked police car, the reality of what had just transpired washing over her. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she could breathe again. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. In Reynolds' office, the scope of William's betrayal became clear. Bank records showed a complex web of fraud stretching back years. Board members were implicated, international partners questioned. The empire William had tried to steal was crumbling, but something new was rising from its ashes. Maggie found herself at the center of it all, working closely with Liam, Chen, and a team of forensic accountants. Late nights poring over documents reminded her of the early days with Thomas, when they'd stay up planning their future, fueled by coffee and dreams. The Thomas Sullivan Foundation, Maggie announced to the gathered press one crisp morning, her voice steady and clear. Dedicated to ethical business practices and community development. My husband's legacy will be one of integrity, not greed. Cameras flashed as she stood at the podium, Liam a reassuring presence beside her. Together, they outlined their plans to restructure Sullivan Construction, implement new oversight measures, and use a significant portion of the recovered funds for community projects. As the questions flew, Maggie felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This was what Thomas had been fighting for, what he'd given his life to protect. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Later that evening, Maggie returned to Thomas's study. The room had been thoroughly searched by the police, but now it was back in order, a silent testament to the man who had built an empire with integrity as its foundation. She sat in his chair, opened his journal, and began to read. Not as a widow seeking answers, but as a woman ready to continue his work. Thomas's voice seemed to rise from the pages, his meticulous notes and observations painting a picture of a man who had seen the corruption creeping in and had fought to stop it. I understand now, she whispered to the empty room. I understand everything. Outside, Charleston's evening bells began to toll, their sound carrying across the city like a promise of redemption. Maggie closed the journal and looked out at the skyline Thomas had helped shape. There was still so much work to do, so many wrongs to right. But for the first time since his death, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As night fell over Charleston, Maggie Sullivan stood at the window, her reflection overlaying the city lights. She was no longer just Thomas's widow, no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She was a force to be reckoned with, a guardian of her husband's legacy, and a woman determined to build something lasting from the ashes of betrayal. The path ahead would not be easy, but Maggie was ready. With Liam by her side and Thomas's spirit guiding her, she would face whatever came next. The Sullivan name would stand for integrity once more, and Charleston, the city Thomas had loved and served, would be better for it. As she turned off the study light and closed the door behind her, Maggie felt a sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, she would rest, knowing that she had taken the first steps toward justice and redemption. The story of Thomas Sullivan and the woman who would carry his legacy forward was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. 2 buttons will appear next to it, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and another to watch other exciting stories. Make your choice. Thanks for watching this far. See you soon.